2024's Lord of the Rings movie is repeating a 23-year-old franchise trick. 2024's animated Lord of the Rings movie, The War of the Rohirrim, is borrowing a storytelling trick from Peter Jackson's original live-action trilogy. The upcoming 2024 animated Lord of the Rings movie, The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, is borrowing a classic storytelling trick from Peter Jackson's original live-action trilogy. Set 261 years before Jackson's trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim follows Helm Hammerhand, a legendary king of Rohan and namesake of Helm's Deep who has to defend his land against an army of Dunlendings. Although Jackson isn't involved, the animated film is set in the same timeline as his trilogy. After being delayed from its initial April release date due to the 2023 SAG-AFTRA strike, The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim is set to arrive in theaters on December 13th. The movie is directed by Blade Runner, Black Lotus Kenji Kamiyama. Miranda Otto is reprising her role as Éowyn from Jackson's Lord of the Rings movies, and the way she's incorporated into the new film seems to be repeating a franchise trend that goes back to the original trilogy. Éowyn will be the narrator of The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, telling the story from far in the future as a shield maiden of Rohan looking back on one of the kingdom's toughest historical conflicts. Otto first played the character in The Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, which saw another epic battle taking place at Helm's Deep. Éowyn will offer an interesting perspective from which to tell the story of Rohan's King of Rohan. Éowyn's role as the narrator of the new movie is similar to how Galadriel, the elf played by Cate Blanchett who ruled Lothlorien in partnership with her husband Celeborn, narrated the first chapter in Jackson's trilogy, The Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. The Elf Queen's voiceover narration was crucial to setting the scene and explaining the lore in the original trilogy. By having Éowyn narrate The War of the Rohirrim, the new movie can get through its exposition just as succinctly and dive right into the story. The way that Galadriel was used in the narration of The Fellowship of the Ring offers a glimpse at how The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim will use Éowyn as the narrator. It seems like she won't be an active participant in the flashbacks, but rather an omniscient narrator. Like Galadriel, Éowyn won't be recounting the flashbacks from a subjective first-person perspective. She'll simply tell the story like an objective historical account. As we continue into the 2020s, the blockbuster film industry has been undergoing major shifts as the trend of comic book movies begins to slow and the major studios are beginning to look for new franchises and stories to take their place. For Warner Brothers and Amazon, their answer to this major change is to embrace the world of Middle-earth created by J.R.R. Tolkien in his Lord of the Rings books. The Lord of the Rings already has an extensive history on film, as Peter Jackson's iconic trilogy just turned 20 years old and his Hobbit trilogy was released in theaters a decade ago at this point. In the years since then, there have been numerous attempts to bring The Lord of the Rings back, but 2024 is likely to be the year that the franchise really makes a big return. There are a few key Lord of the Rings projects set for release this year, while the development and announcement of new films and shows is almost a certainty. Looking ahead to 2024, here is what fans of Tolkien and The Lord of the Rings can expect: The Rings of Power, Season 2. First of all, one of the biggest ways that The Lord of the Rings will return in 2024 is through the Prime Video series The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power. The show first premiered in 2022 and it sparked plenty of heated conversations and debates upon its release. The first season of the show was frequently described as the most expensive season of television ever produced, as Amazon spent an estimated $55 million on each chapter of the 8-episode debut season. Additionally, the show caused quite a division among Lord of the Rings fans as its depiction and adaptation of Middle-earth's Second Age featured plenty of new ideas and deviations from the books. Despite some of the immense toxicity surrounding the online discussion of the series, The Rings of Power was still a solid hit for Prime Video and it has more than warranted the development of a second season. Filming of the second season was completed in the summer of 2023, prior to the beginning of the SAG strike. The second season is currently deep in post-production, with many complicated visual effects shots surely taking a long time to complete. Given how beautiful the first season and the previous Lord of the Rings films have been visually, there are high expectations for the sophomore season of The Rings of Power. Season 2 of The Rings of Power has yet to receive an official release date, but given that it is already in post-production, it is expected to drop sometime in 2024, likely in the summer or fall. This could possibly set up a rematch between the series and HBO's powerhouse Game of Thrones prequel, House of the Dragon, which also has its second season set for release in the summer of 2024. The two fantasy shows were famously both airing episodes of their first seasons at the same time, which made them compete directly against one another. While it's unlikely that this release overlap will occur again with both of their second seasons, they are both likely to compete against one another again by releasing near one another in the same year. The second season of The Rings of Power isn't the only new Lord of the Rings story hitting screens in 2024, nor do we think it is the most interesting. While Amazon owns the television rights to produce new Lord of the Rings shows, the film rights are still held by Warner Brothers, which had previously produced Jackson's Lord of the Rings and Hobbit films. With Hollywood increasingly becoming a competition between recognizable properties, WB has decided to revisit The Lord of the Rings again in an effort to bring the franchise back to big screens. The first film of this endeavor is not, as you would expect, another live-action adventure. Instead, it is an animated feature that is visually inspired by many popular anime films as well as the live-action Lord of the Rings films. This film, titled The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, is a spin-off/prequel that tells the story of the famous Helm Hammerhand, King of Rohan, who ruled over 250 years prior to the events of The Lord of the Rings. It was in honor of the brave deeds and ferocity of Helm Hammerhand that Helm's Deep, the Rohirrim stronghold featured in The Two Towers, was given its name. This new animated film is also firmly set within the same continuity of Jackson's Lord of the Rings films, as Miranda Otto is returning to voice the character of Éowyn, whom she played previously in both The Two Towers and The Return of the King. Éowyn will serve as the film's narrator as she recounts the legend of Helm Hammerhand, who will be voiced by Brian Cox. The film had previously been set to release in theaters in April, but it was recently delayed to December 2024. With that, it will now release in time for the holiday season next year, just as the 6 other Lord of the Rings movies have previously. While The Rings of Power and The War of the Rohirrim are the only 2 new Lord of the Rings projects that will be seen on film and television next year, that does not mean that they are the only 2 that are in development. Earlier in 2023, WB Discovery President David Zaslav discussed how he felt that the studio has been undervaluing and underutilizing the Lord of the Rings franchise. Because of this, he and the studio intend to start actively developing new Lord of the Rings films. As is already evident with The War of the Rohirrim, which was already in development long before Zaslav got the top job, these films could be anything set in the world of Middle-earth, whether they be prequels, sequels, or spin-offs. Specifically, Zaslav stated that he envisioned The Lord of the Rings operating similarly to Disney's Star Wars, with new films opening every few years. Since this announcement, there has been very little further news about what the future of The Lord of the Rings on film and TV will be. However, we anticipate that 2024 will bring with it some specific announcements of new films in order to build anticipation for The War of the Rohirrim. The world of Middle-earth is broad and its histories are extensive, so there is an endless array of different stories that could be told. However, it's important to recognize that the rights to various Tolkien stories, such as those within the Silmarillion, are complicated and likely not under WB's umbrella. However, there are still many fan-favorite stories like The War with Ammar or The Tale of Beren and Luthien that could be possible.